Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It is July 27th, 2026. It just happens to be my birthday, actually. I'm 78 years old today, born July 27th, 1948. So apparently my health seems to be reasonably good. I just swam 1,300 meters the other day, followed by 43 push-ups, and I'm back doing pull-ups. I did 3 pull-ups, took a rest, and then did 2 more, which is not a lot. But a couple of years ago, before I injured myself with a hernia, I was able to do like up to 15 pull-ups. I don't know if I'll ever be able to reach that point, but I hope I can. Anyway, that's not the purpose of my video, but what you can do is, if you'd like to support my channel on my birthday, that would be wonderful. But of course, I say that truth is priceless, so I will never charge money for the support. But what you can do is share my videos and comment and the like. So I'm talking about here this idea that has Russia gone the way of Iran? And the reason I bring this up is because I have I have contacts within Russia, and also in Ukraine, for that matter. I have a very dear friend in Ukraine. So the way I go about my work is I try to find information that is not readily available in the Western mainstream media. And just to make note, I was doing a search for one of the topics in this discussion, and I went to Google, and they absolutely did not talk about one of the issues that I wanted to talk about. So I went to Yandex, and sure enough, there were articles on Yandex that discuss the issues that I'm going to bring up in this video. So with that as an introduction, I'll just explain that since Russia has been exercising what we call strategic patience, and people have been talking about this for quite a long time. He's tried negotiating many, many times. Iran has tried negotiating many, many times. And recently, in the case of Iran, they said no more negotiations. And I'll be talking about this more. And it appears that the Russian people are reaching the point where they're saying the same thing. So that's what I'll be talking about. So as an introduction, since World War II, the Soviet Union watches Nazi holdovers such as the Operation Gladio and the Galen Organization planned to finish off first the Soviet Union and then Russia. And Soviet President Gorbachev thought he would deprive the West of its obsessive paranoia about Russia by declaring an end to the Cold War and withdrawing the Soviet army from occupying its buffering states of Eastern Europe. So let's recall that the United States declared the entire Western Hemisphere off limits to outside powers, and over time since World War II, to protect U.S. interests, has established 800 or so military bases all over the world. While insisting that Russia is the expansionist power. So Russia has a few military bases in the former Soviet republics and a couple of other bases, but the United States has 800 while insisting that Russia is the one that's expansionist. Now, NATO gave assurances to the Soviet leadership that it would not expand NATO if Germany were allowed to reunite. East Germany, then in the Soviet orbit, would reunite with West Germany, which was part of NATO, which was also a violation, by the way, of the principle of German post-World War II neutrality. Meanwhile, the CIA was supporting Stefan Bandera, whose ideology now dominates Ukraine's government. I'm quoting here from an internal CIA document. What was the Banderist resurrected Ukraine like at the time? It is hard to find an adequate definition for the quote-unquote mongrel state created by Bandera and Stetsko under the sonorous name of the Ukrainian state. If one were to judge this brainchild of Bandera even by totalitarian standards, one would find that the element of law and legality, which are present even in totalitarian states, were absent there. However bad and cruel these laws are, they still contain some elements of right and order. Um, um, there was nothing of the kind in the kingdom of Stetsko on Bandera. Bloody chaos, utter lawlessness, and the wildness and most vicious excesses in the treatment of the Ukrainian population and the national minorities prevailed. That is, Romanians, Poles, and so on. Unbridled terrorism was used to force dissenters to submit to the leaders, and thousands of people were killed without trial, without investigation, and often without any apparent cause. So, and the United States has been that was the coup government that was installed in 2014. Back to my text here. This is an excerpt from the CIA archives that I just quoted from. And even now, the United States has statues in the United States honoring Stefan Bandera. I have a quote from Wikipedia. It says, monuments in the United States to Nazi collaborators, monuments to Ukrainian collaborators. And there are other Nazi collaborators in that article, but we're talking specifically about Ukrainian collaborators with the Nazis during World War II. So this is another quote. Conclusions. In the context of the Cold War aggravation, the CIA studied the activities of Eastern European emigre groups for the purpose of cooperation, and among the Ukrainians identified the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council as such. The cooperation began in 1948 under the codename Aerodynamics and lasted until 1990, right around the time of the Soviet Union's demise. The first stage of the operation was the penetration of the CIA assets into Ukraine, and after 1954, it was carried out in the form of cooperation with the Research and Publishing Association Prologue. And this is an article from SOTT.net, that's signsofthetimes.net. CIA documents reveal fascist Ukrainian icon Stefan Bandera was a German spy and a CIA accomplice. So these are all quotes, and there's a link in it. However, following the demise of the Soviet Union, which itself has been questioned as illegal if de facto, in other words, it was never legally disbanded, but it is de facto disbanded, Russia maintained a hands-off policy towards Ukraine, letting it go its own way. However, according to my acquaintances in Sevastopol in 2015, when I visited there, the Kiev authorities denied language rights to the mainly Russian-speaking Crimea, insisting that all documents must be in Ukrainian. So, my friends, this couple said that under the even during the Soviet times, they were not allowed to. They discouraged the use of Russian language, and documents were in Ukrainian, even though they couldn't even speak Ukrainian. It wasn't their natural language. It's as if in Canada, Canada is a bilingual country. Some of it is English speaking, some of it is French speaking. And if the French decided that English were going to be forbidden as a language, and that everybody who speaks French has to speak everybody who speaks English has to speak French, and all the documents are going to be in French. That was basically what happened in Ukraine. And so it was like a setup for failure from the beginning when the Ukrainian nationalists got control after the Soviet Union ended. Now, Russia also stood by in the 2014 coup against the democratically elected government, which installed Bandera followers in charge. An 8-year war ensued against those who opposed the coup. And under Putin, President Putin, Russia pursued negotiations to resolve the problem in 2014, 2015, 2021, 2022, and on up to the Anchorage meeting with President Trump. That too has ended in failure. In fact, Foreign Minister Lavrov has stated that Russian faith in negotiations has been exhausted. And this long after the Russians' Foreign Service realizing that the U.S. is quote unquote non-agreement capable. I've got an article here I'm quoting from by the independent blogger Moon of Alabama, who's been around for quite a while. And this was reproduced on the Ron Paul Institute website in 2022, 4 years ago. The link is How Russia Can and Will De-NATOize Europe. So here's the quote. No negotiations or peace agreements will prevent that. The U.S. is famously non-agreement capable. It has broken all promises and agreements it has ever made with Russia. Dozens of U.S. and European luminaries had promised to Russia that NATO would expand not 1 inch towards Russia. Look where its borders are now. The U.S. and the EU have confiscated huge amounts of Russian state-owned money. They have even taken, in contradiction to their own constitutions, the idea of private property, the properties of private Russian citizens, just because those persons happen to be Russian. In 2014, continuing the quote, Germany and France signed on to guarantee elections for a peaceful regime change in Kiev. A day later, the fascists stormed the Ukrainian parliament, and those guarantees turned out to be totally worthless. The U.S. simply said, this was Victoria Nuland, caught on camera, caught on the phone, F the EU. And she didn't say F, she used their actual word. It does not give, again, excuse my language here, I'm quoting, it does not give a shit about European interests. Germany and France later negotiated and signed the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. They continued to feed billions of EU money into Ukraine, even as the Ukrainian government, controlled by the US, did nothing to fulfill them. Yes, they were that stupid. Up to now, the apparent policy of Russia has been strategic patience or strategic restraint, getting back to my text here. However, in my opinion, there were 3 major events that have changed the situation. First is the ramping up of the drone war against targets inside Russia, including an apparent assassination attempt on President Putin while at his Valdai residence. There have also been serious attacks on civilian infrastructure inside Russia's borders in Rostov and in Bryansk and of course in Lugansk and Donetsk, but of course especially in Crimea. So this is especially important to me personally because I have friends who live in Crimea, and they have been saying that the situation there is not good. They have intermittent water and intermittent electricity. Their places near them have been bombed, and this is not a good situation. They're anxious, and yes, there are Russians who say, just have a stiff upper lip, but these are people, they're actually living there, and this is no fun. So, put yourself in the shoes of somebody whose city has been bombed, and you can't be sure of when your electricity is going to be there or your water or whatever. So that is what's been going on in Crimea. And the last point is that there's appointment of a new military commander named Derpati. And here's what Ukraine says about him. This is a quote. This is a link. The new commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Derpati, stated that Russians as a nation have no right to exist, and that only criminal elements have lived in Donbass their entire lives. So when saying something has no right to exist is these are fighting words. Let's put it that way. Now, after his appointment as commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Tripathi was finally allowed to speak to journalists. This is again quoting. During his first interview, the general stated that he did not consider Russians equal to Ukrainians. Any racism there? Like blacks aren't equal to whites, Russians aren't equal to Ukrainians, and that this nation had no right to exist. According to him, Russians had never been civilized for thousands of years, waging wars of conquest and attempting to build an empire, and their behavior hasn't changed. This harks back, in my opinion, to the quote of the Declaration of Independence, where our founding fathers talked about the merciless red-skinned savages whose land has been invaded by us, and yet we consider them to be the savages. So this is the same kind of mentality that infects the Ukrainian leadership at this time, in my opinion. So from what I can see, the lines have been drawn. I'm going to be quoting from a couple of items here. First, there are two Russians speaking of the current situation based on the above discussed factors. There's a YouTube link and an auto-dubbed discussion between two Russian academics and military thinkers. The video features a conversation between somebody named Igor Shishkin and Andrei Ilnitsky, a senior researcher at the military university, discussing the escalation in the Russia-West conflict and the shift to a new phase of confrontation. And this is when you have a YouTube video, there's an ask function, and you can ask them to summarize the video. That is what I'm quoting from here. So the key takeaways and discussion points. First, the escalation ladder. The discussion centers on the response to Western provocations, specifically following the NATO summit in Ankara, which is very, very hostile to Russia, basically declaring war on Russia. Ilnitsky argues that Russia has begun responding to these escalations by targeting critical Ukrainian infrastructure rather than just traditional decision-making centers. Next point, infrastructure warfare. Ilnitsky outlines a strategy of disabling logistical, energy, and port infrastructure to render the Ukraine state non-functional. He contends that this is a more effective and necessary condition for achieving victory than focusing solely on battlefield gains or political centers. Third point, strategic threats and internal stability. The speakers analyzed the threat of internal destabilization in Russia, drawing parallels to the events of February 1917. They mentioned Western projects like the British Alchemy, aimed at weakening Russia from within by targeting public morale and elite loyalty. The situation in Crimea. Ilnitsky reflects on his recent trip. This is important. His recent trip to Crimea and Sevastopol. I have a friend who lives in Sevastopol. I was asking her, what her opinion of the situation was. She replied, "It's not good. It wouldn't be a good idea to visit there at this time." He reports that despite the threat of drone attacks and infrastructure issues, the population remains resilient and organized, supported by volunteer efforts like Bars Crimea. Next, he talks about the role of NATO and AI. The guests discuss the recent NATO declaration in Ankara, noting that the alliance is moving towards a more direct, institutionalized support role for Ukraine, effectively turning the country into a technological, quote-unquote, polygon for Western military and AI systems such as Palantir. And finally, the mental and cognitive war. This is probably the most important part. The closing segment emphasizes that the current conflict is not just military, but deeply cognitive and mental. I've been talking about the war on consciousness from the very, very beginning. That is what is really going on here on all levels. Ilnitsky highlights the necessity of social, societal, and elite mobilization comparing the current situation to historical crises where internal unity was the deciding factor for the nation's survival. Now, I contacted another friend of mine who lives in Crimea, and the question arose, what approach should Russia take in this situation? Should they send nuclear missiles? No. Should they send Resnik missiles? No. Should they exercise strategic restraint and just keep things going as they are since Russia is winning on the battlefield? No. The consensus view, according to this one person, is total mobilization, that they really need to, there's an existential threat from this regime that's in Ukraine, installed by the United States and the West with the intent of destroying Russia. So, and Russia's saying, we've kind of figured it out. We've tried to negotiate. We thought we could, work things out, but we understand now that there's no negotiation possible. Now, I want to point out the parallels between Iran and Russia. It appears to me that after many years of attempting to negotiate with the West, culminating with Trump's trashing of the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, followed by his assassination of the esteemed Iranian General Soleimani, followed by two perfidious negotiations, which the U.S. and Israel violated by an attempted decapitation strike on Iran's leadership, and again another attack during another triad negotiation, the Iranian people themselves have had it with the USA. Huge turnouts for the funeral of the Ayatollah and his family, accompanied by calls for revenge, demonstrate this. And independent journalists such as Patrick Henningsen and Dmitry Leskaris, who are both in Iran covering that event of the funeral, indicate that that there's been a real sea change in the attitude of Iranian people. So based on his recent trip to Iran, Patrick Henningsen describes the Iranian public's sentiment as highly cohesive and resilient. He states that the population shares a deep sense of solidarity, which he describes as almost a hive mind regarding the conflict with the U.S. and Israel. He explains that this unity is not the result of orders from a central office, but rather a shared conviction that has been amplified by external pressures. Henningsen further observes that the Iranian people view the conflict as a war of attrition and are prepared for the long haul in order to evict U.S. influence from the region, remaining undeterred by threats, sanctions, or intimidations. And this is essentially the same attitude that Russia has regarding NATO. In 2021, Russia said, you guys, promised you weren't going to expand. You have expanded. You're right up to our borders. You are threatening us, and you're going to have to go back to where you came from. And if you don't, then all bets are off, and NATO probably needs to be disbanded. Iran is essentially saying the same thing. It's an issue of evicting U.S. influence from West Asia, and basically this is what we're talking about here, is evicting Western incursions into the Eurasian continent from Eurasia. So the conclusion here is that the West's 500-year implacable and relentless war against the rest, I call it the war of the West against the rest, is headed for a climax. It will not and cannot allow sovereignty, that is the West, of other nations. Indeed, it views itself as the garden that Joseph Borrell, who was I forget his title was like the supreme foreign minister of the EU, something like that. He says that the West is the garden and the rest is the jungle. despite the fact that Eurasian civilizations existed long before European, and then the US was founded. So somehow the US, which has a history going back to 1610, thinks it should determine what Iran should be, even though Iran was unified as a nation under the Median kingdom in the 7th century BC. So here we are in the year 2026. The US has been around since 1620, 400 years, and Iran has been around since the 7th century BC, and yet somehow the United States thinks that we're the morally superior, intellectually superior entity. This is, delusional and extremely dangerous. The hubris is just, off the charts. And Russia, for its part, goes back at least 1,000 years. The Mongols invaded in 1240, followed by Germans, Poles, Swedes, French, Germans again in the 1940s, and even the English attacked Russia 3 times. And the Crimean War, after the Russian Revolution, and again, now there are English officers in Ukraine. They're basically participating in the attack on Russia, and English weapons are being used against Russia. So, and Russia has never done that to England. It's all been this one-way street of trying to destroy Russia. So, and of course, Wall Street also plundered Russia in the 1990s. So that was essentially an economic invasion of the United States of Russia. So both countries have exercised restraint and patience and numerous attempts at negotiation. At this point, both realize that negotiations are pointless in the face of Western obsession with hegemony. So the question is, how far will the West go to maintain dominance? It's going to try attrition warfare, and if that doesn't work, subversion. They'll try to send their agents in and stir up trouble. And if that doesn't work, they'll try maybe invasions. The U.S. is talking about invading Iran. And of course, there are military bases surrounding Russia, in Lithuania and other countries, and certainly in Ukraine. And the goal eventually is to invade Russia and take it over. So, but if that doesn't work, what is the last option for the West? That's nuclear war. So that is where we are. And the fact that you have these two civilizational countries recognizing that the end of the line has come in terms of negotiations, they realize that they're just you cannot placate a relentless, implacable opponent that is embodied by the West, and it's going to involve a lot of bloodshed, and it's a terrible situation, but that's how it is. So that's the way I see it, and that's the way I see people in Russia talking about it. Not everybody, but there seems to be an emerging consensus, which is indicated by the video that I included here, as well as people that I've personally talked with. So that's what I've got to say here. It's a dangerous situation, and it's a very sad situation. But here we are. Who would have thought that 80 years after the end of World War II, we would be back where we started from with the West. It started World War I, which caused the death of millions of people. They couldn't resist, and they started World War II again, causing tens of millions of people. And now we're flirting with nuclear weapons, which could cause hundreds of millions or even billions of people. That's the situation we're in. So on that happy note, Please, like and share my video. Please comment on it. And if you can, make a donation or buy something from my Peace and Enlightenment shop, please do so. So thanks again for listening, and I will talk with you again soon.